public library collections providing a civil penalty.
The chair recognizes Mr. Alders to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this is a simple bill intended to protect our Texas kids. This bill addresses a real issue that we have seen in our public libraries across the state, and it does so in a way that is reasonable as well as effective. It's not a complicated bill. It shouldn't be controversial. HB 3225 simply requires municipal public libraries to move books with sexually explicit material out of the sections for minors and into the section for adults. We do have an amendment.
Mrs. Weiner, for what purpose?
The gentleman yield for questions.
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
I can. Some of the questions may be better asked after the amendment, but I'm happy to
The gentleman
answer
yields.
any.
Yeah. Thank you, Representative Alders, and would certainly be happy to visit on the full bill at the end. But I think I want to ask some questions about things that I don't think are going to be addressed in the amendment. And I think some of the main area we have some disagreement on is the question of teenagers and what teenagers should have access to. And so as I read your bill correct, this is going to restrict the ability of teenagers to be able to check out many books in the library. Is that correct?
Restrict is a little bit beyond what I would say. What I'm trying to do is ensure that material is placed where appropriate, and we're giving parents the opportunity to play a role in their kids growing up and accessing content that would be deemed inappropriate by most of us for children, for minors. And so giving parents that opportunity to enable their kids when appropriate to have access to that is the goal of this legislation.
Okay. So functionally, this legislation would mean that, well, let me go back from functionally and say, on its face, what your legislation would do is say that all minors, regardless of how old they are, cannot check out books with sexually explicit material as it's defined unless they have permission of their parents. Is that correct?
Yes, parent, legal guardian, that is correct.
Okay. And that prohibition and those definitions are consistent regardless of whether we're talking about a 5-year-old or a 17-year-old, correct?
That would be correct, yes. I would assume that as children are growing up and teenagers have the opportunity to interface in a more mature manner with certain content out there in the world, that's very likely that they'll have that access. I mean, when you're applying for a library card, you can get that taken care of pretty easily and have that access granted. I want parents to be able to have that opportunity to help direct and protect their kids when appropriate, and then give them those opportunities as well when it's appropriate.
So libraries usually have thousands of titles, potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of titles,
Absolutely.
correct?
Correct.
One of the things that concerns me is that with the way this bill is structured is that libraries may functionally just have to deny access to anything out of the minor section to teenagers. Are you concerned about that?
We've worked, so that's one of the areas where I believe the amendment will be helpful because we have interacted with Texas Library Association and TSLAC to ensure that this bill is written in a way that libraries can be successful, that they can operate within the goals of the stated goals of this legislation and actually be able to protect our kids and move the books that are needed to be moved in an efficient manner, and then protect those and curate those collections appropriately moving forward. And so the amendment addresses some of the timeline, what we mean by access, so that the definitions are clear, the expectations are clear.
Okay. And I want to be really clear. I really appreciate the work you've done with Texas Library Association to make sure this bill doesn't fundamentally undermine library operations. So I earnestly really appreciate that. I think my concerns are we have teenagers who get pregnant. Would a pregnant teenager be able to check out a book on pregnancy from the adult section without their parents' permission?
I don't believe that pregnancy is going to be covered under the definition of sexual conduct that I have in this bill.
Okay.
So that should not be an issue.
Okay. What about a novel that's maybe speaking to their experience of another teenager who has become pregnant, and perhaps that moment of becoming pregnant is included in that book. Would that teenager, again, who has clearly already had that experience because they're pregnant, would they be able to check out that book without their parents' consent?
They would need, I mean, they'd need a guardian or parental permission to be able to access this. If it has been moved to the adult section and the content of the book falls under the definition of sexual conduct, then yes, that would be necessary.
Now, being a minor does not stop somebody from having adult experiences. 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds all make choices wisely or not.
Correct.
And a lot of young adult literature attempts to speak to those experiences many teenagers may have and help them connect there. Are you concerned about teenagers not having access to books that are relevant to them and the lives they're living?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I don't think that obviously minors have a lot of interactions prior to that ideally occurring in their life, and it can be good or bad. I think we all know that they have access to a lot of material online, and when there's a need to understand what's going on, that's a separate conversation. Our conversation in this legislation in 3225 is addressing collections in our public libraries that are accessible by every member of the public, and children need to be protected from sexually explicit material, and our children being confronted with that when they are not, when they have not been in that position in the past. And so I think the important thing to know about this legislation is, one, it's focused on public libraries that are accessed by all members of the public, our children, our families, and we need to protect the kids who it's not helpful for them to have this as their first experience with this kind of content.
So, Representative Alders, you keep using kids, and I do want to be clear, a lot of what I'm trying to ask about is teens.
Correct.
Are you aware that the U.S. Supreme Court has found that minors do have a First Amendment right to access of information?
Sure.
And are you aware that the U.S. Supreme Court has found that when looking at material that can be restricted from minors, despite their First Amendment rights, that you have to draw that line differently depending on the age of the minor?
I would again point to the definition that we have in this book. This is not a question of access to information. This is an access to sexually explicit content. And we define that very clearly, and I mean, it's a definition that, you can read from the back mic, but it's material that we do not want our children to have. I don't want my children to have. I don't think it's beneficial for them. And so I think it's important that we protect our kids in the state of Texas and ensure that they can access the books in their public library for their benefit, for their good, and are not confronted unknowingly with material that is going to potentially traumatize them for the rest of their life.
Are you familiar with the Miller test?
Right.
Are you familiar
Ask
with
that
the
again.
three-pronged Miller test?
No.
So the three-pronged Miller test is a constitutional standard for obscenity, and it requires that to be considered obscene. Material must be, 1, appeal to a prurient interest, 2, must be patently offensive, and 3, contain no other value. When we look at that for minors, we apply all those tests to minors. Does your bill use that type of three-pronged definition?
I think if you look at the definition that we have on page 2, that it would fall in line with what you're talking about there.
The piece I'm concerned about is that last piece of having no other artistic or literary or other value for minors. We have books, I'll use a very commonly challenged one, The Bluest Eye by Nobel Prize winning author Toni Morrison. That book is 230 pages long. there are 5 pages on it that have any type of sexual content that might be considered explicit. Under your bill, provided those 5 pages, I'll concede may fall under this definition, provided there's a book with 5 pages that fall under this definition, would minors, including older teens, be prevented from checking that book out without parental permission?
Without parental permission, no, they shouldn't. And as you said, those 5 pages contain descriptions that fall within my definition. And I mean, it's the same thing with media. You don't have an X-rated movie because the entire movie contains explicit scenes. You don't have an R-rated movie because the entire film contains nonstop R-rated activity. It's based on small portions of content within the greater scope. And I think that's what we're looking at here, is that if you have text within a book that describes graphically according to the definition that we have in this bill, then it needs to be moved to the adult section of the library. We need to protect our kids. We need to protect their vulnerabilities and acknowledge that that kind of content is bad for them. It's not good for them to interact with without someone coming alongside and explaining. And you and I have had good conversations about this over the last few days. It's not to say all of this is never appropriate for them to interact with, and there's opportunities for someone to talk through something that is important in their lives where you've had a traumatic incident and they need to figure out how to communicate. But that is not what we're talking about here in this legislation. And having someone who comes alongside and helps a child understand how to deal with a traumatic situation in their life, that's a separate issue. And you need those books. These books need to be in the adult section of the library, and you need guidance on how to deal with the issues that we've talked about.
I think you and I have slightly different perspectives on the traumatic side of this, but I want to come back. I really am grateful that you brought up the movie rating system. Are you aware that that system is entirely voluntary by the industry and doesn't have the force of law because of First Amendment concerns?
It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist for a good purpose to protect the viewers that are out there. And maybe we need to change that. So.
And speaking of the movie rating system again, does the movie rating system just draw one hard line for minors and non-minors, or does it have different graduated levels for different age groups?
It does, but take the issue, if we're talking about X-rated movies, you have to be 18 or older, at least you used to be 18 or older, to be able to go to the theater and watch an X-rated film, right? And so we're talking about X-rated material being in the adult section of the library. I don't think there's much of a difference there, if any.
I think many of us would dispute that the books that would be covered by this definition would be the equivalent of an X-rated movie. I
would beg to differ on that.
I think the concern is that some of these books feel PG-13 to us, or are, and quite
I would submit that that is
those.
because we have become numb to some of this material in our culture today. And for better or worse, we're inundated with content around us that has allowed us to become numb over the years. And so just because it feels PG-13 doesn't mean that it is that. But we've allowed our standards to drop in a way that is unhelpful, and it allows us then to look at something that would never have been appropriate for our children 20, 30, 40 years ago, and gone, well, that's probably okay. They're probably going to run into it anyway out there in the world. I think that's a dangerous place for us to be.
Well, I appreciate that perspective, and I will be frank, I share some of your concerns about sort of over-sexualization of culture and what young people can be exposed to. I think where we differ is whether or not books are part of that problem. So when somebody engages with fiction, a book is asking them to step into the shoes of somebody that's going through something and experiencing something. And again, that might involve a sexual situation. It might involve a teen making decisions around that. And do you not think that people being asked to engage fully with a sexual situation, with the emotional consequences, with the real life consequences, is actually an antidote to some of this hypersexualized little instances, divorced from all context, divorced from all sense of real life?
I don't think that that is the proper way to handle a situation like that, for one. And for two, we're protecting kids whether they've gone through that kind of a situation like you're referring to, and those who haven't. And I think we need to remember that, most kids hopefully are not having to go through those kinds of hard times, and they need a piece of literature to help them understand what they went through. What about all the kids who have not, and who are innocently going through the shelves of their minor section of the library, and they pull off one of these books innocently, and they flip through it, and they're confronted with this, and that's their first interaction? I think we need to take that into consideration, and that's what this legislation is intended to do.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I want to back up a little. I think I wasn't clear on exactly what I was trying to talk about. Let's say a music video. I don't listen to any new music, so I don't have any current examples. But let's say a music video that is, we would all agree, raunchy and very sexualized, very objectifying. Do you not see the opportunity to engage with the same type of content, with the emotion and consequences and real life implications that are involved in a piece of fiction, as being an antidote to those one-off sort of sensationalized visual performances that are viewable so easily everywhere?
I think this would be one of those instances where we would just have to agree to disagree.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for answering my questions, Representative Alders.
Thank you.